Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Shenot with the Regulators Systems Project, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on capturing more value from distributed resource combinations. I suspect all of you have seen plenty of presentations by now about the rapid growth of distributed energy resources, or DERs. Maybe you've also seen presentations on the benefits of energy efficiency, or on the capabilities of energy storage, or even the value of solar. In today's webinar, we're going to probe a little deeper into this concept of DER value and explore how combinations of DERs can enhance that value. We'll also look at ways to compensate the owners of DERs for the values that they provide, and review some actions that could be taken to capture more value from DERs and DER combinations. I'll be joined on today's presentation by my RAP colleague, Dr. Carl Linvill. Before we get started, let me explain just a couple of process-related points. Because there are a large number of attendees on today's webinar, we're going to keep all of you muted. You can submit questions, however, in the questions box on your GoToMeeting window. And we will do our best to get to as many of your questions as we can. This webinar is going for 60 minutes, but Carl and I are willing to stay on for an additional half hour afterwards if there are more questions that we have not yet answered. And then finally, you should also know that this webinar is being recorded. In a few days, we'll send you a link to the recording and also to our slides. The basis for today's webinar is a new RAP report, which was supported in part by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory through their Solar Energy Innovation Network. However, I have to say the opinions expressed in this report and on this webinar are RAPs and RAPs alone. You'll see here a link to the full report, which we'll show you again at the end of the webinar. So let's take a quick look at three key takeaways from our report. First, combinations of DERs offer new value opportunities. Our goal in this effort is not to subsidize DERs. Rather, it's to reasonably compensate those that produce positive net benefits. Second, to capture more value, we're going to need to enable new technologies, improve tariffs, and reform market, planning, and procurement processes. And third, DER owners, utilities, state regulators, and federal agencies like FERC can all take steps now to encourage beneficial DERs. The push to capture more value from DER combinations is not merely aspirational or theoretical. It's already happening in a growing number of cases around the country. It's happening in Owatonna, Minnesota, where Steelwicka Cooperative is combining community solar with a demand response program that uses controllable electric water heaters. And we'll show you later how this combination benefits all of the co-op's members. It's also happening at more than a dozen U.S. Army bases where the need for resilience is paramount. And different mixes of DERs are being deployed and used to sustain critical national security functions, even when the grid goes down. And it's happening in Oakland, California, where a community choice aggregator and the utility PG&E have identified a package of DERs that can eliminate the need for a major transmission project at a fraction of the cost. We're going to hear more about these examples later, but first we want to circle back to some basics. I'm going to hand it over to Carl now to talk about the value of DERs. Carl? Carl, I think you're muted.
Thanks, John, and thanks for noting I was muted. And hello, everyone. It's great to be with you today. Individual DERs and combinations of DERs produce value streams that together make up the value of their service. Opportunities for DERs to meet value, to offer value and meet customer and electric system needs are expanding as the modernized interactive grid comes into being. But that doesn't mean that we don't have examples out there where this has already happened. Here's a nice example from Minnesota where we see some value streams added up. These value streams focus on how DERs can offer value by avoiding otherwise necessary grid costs. It should be noted that not all DERs provide all of these values, and that some of these values depend on location, availability, and use of the DERs. So the purpose of this slide is to not start you off by asserting that DERs are worth 12 cents a kilowatt hour or so. Rather, we're just offering this as an illustration where value streams have been identified and a summing up has been tried. It's important to note at this point that these are just examples, and this slide, in fact, doesn't include some benefits that are sometimes included in summing up the values of DERs. For example, non-energy benefits. Non-energy benefits can be really important in figuring out if a DER is beneficial for society and for customers at large. For example, EPA recently produced a study that estimated that each kilowatt hour of renewable energy or energy efficiency savings can reduce public health costs by between 1 and 7 cents. We do have in the report a more complete list of potential value streams, and so we encourage you to look at that and read that carefully. Research on DERs is not new. It was initiated more than 40 years ago, and that doesn't mean that there isn't still plenty of work to be done. But certain resources are well covered. Solar, most recently value of solar studies, energy efficiency has been studied extensively. Cost effectiveness tests for ratepayer-funded EE programs continue to be improved upon, but an extensive literature dates back to before the original California Standard Practice Manual back in the early 1980s. On the other hand, there are other resources like smart building capabilities, batteries, and electric vehicles, where studies have been done recently, but we're really much earlier in the process of figuring out what those value streams look like. And furthermore, the value streams are really still emerging as customers and the grid learn how to take advantage of the full range of capabilities that can be offered by these resources. And then last of all, we have combinations of DERs, and combinations of DERs have really rarely been studied to date. They're brand new. The purpose of this paper and our work here, and the resources we provide, is to help lay some foundation for thinking about what the value of service research should be and what's needed on combinations of distributed energy resources. One of the first questions that we need to ask ourselves when we think about the value of DERs is whose value are we talking about? The value to whom is an important question that, again, has been around as long as the California Standard Practice Manual. We see here some of these tests that were created and have evolved, and some that are relatively new. For example, the resource value test is relatively new. These tests were developed primarily for energy efficiency, but increasingly are being used as a foundation for addressing the value of DERs. Each test looks at cost effectiveness from a different perspective, answering that question, value to whom? Cost effectiveness tests identify many value streams, far more than the avoided cost value streams alone. Cost effectiveness tests tell us whether a resource is adding value for all utility customers, for example, with the PAC test, or sometimes called the utility test, whether it's adding value for society as a whole through something like the societal cost test. The participant test is really important because DERs are adopted by customers or by people, by businesses, by organizations. Those organizations need to do the math and figure out whether investing in these resources makes sense, whether the value streams that are going to flow toward them justify their investment. If the resource or the combination of resources is producing a positive net benefit for society and for all customers, we certainly hope that that private investment steps in and invests in these important and emerging technologies that can avoid many other costs. In order for that to happen, the value stream that finds its way to the customer has to be adequate to induce that customer investment and induce the operation of the resource for the benefit of the system and all customers. Now, just because we add up value streams and we come up with a value of service, we're not suggesting that the sum of all these values should equal the compensation received. The value of service can be useful in determining compensation, but it's not the end of the story. Cost effectiveness tests are helpful in evaluating if the net benefits are positive from the various perspectives, which is very useful information for regulators to have. Participant test, as I said, is very important in determining whether these resources are going to be invested in with private capital, which can benefit everyone. So I encourage you not to think of the package of the value of services as adding up to what fair compensation is. Rather, these cost effectiveness tests and these streams of value of service should be used wisely to assess what fair compensation looks like. In looking at compensation and in coming up with what is fair, one of the first lessons is not to get bogged down in trying to quantify every element precisely, or any element precisely. If a value stream is able to be quantified very precisely, then that's great. But producing estimates that are good enough to evaluate the net benefits is what's really important. And several details are really important to remember as you start down that road. First of all, calculations should seek to reflect the time that the resource can provide service. The value of providing service at its location on the grid is important. And it's also important to consider the independence among value streams. Some value streams may be mutually exclusive or may affect each other. For example, offering a resource to provide capacity at a particular place on the grid may limit your ability to use that resource for another purpose. So assessing the interdependence of the streams when you try to think about what an overall value looks like is really important. In addition, value estimates should be anchored in solid proxies when they're available, such as market price proxies. But again, we need to emphasize that there are value streams that don't have that handy proxy available. And expert judgment will be necessary in an administrative process in order to land on a reasonable estimate. Another point to emphasize as we think about compensation is we really want compensation to be lined up so that the choices that customers make are beneficial to all customers and to society as a whole, And the foundation of that is setting our rates and our rate design in a way that is smart, that conveys value of consuming at different times and of producing at different times. For example, calculations should seek to reflect the time that the resource can provide service. The value of providing service at its location on the grid is important, and again, interdependence. Poor rate design can induce investment that satisfies private interests of the participant, but not the public interest of all customers and society as a whole. For example, flat rate designs don't recognize the value of service to the grid, depends on when the service is delivered. And poorly designed demand charges can create private benefit opportunities that don't necessarily translate into public benefit outcomes. Smart rate design should seek to reflect system costs and rates so the participant investment choices and operational behavior align with the public interest. In short, we can say that rate design should make the choices the customer makes to optimize their own bill consistent with the choices that we would make to minimize the overall system costs for all customers. Next, John will describe how combinations of DERs are providing value opportunities.
Thanks, Carl. So Carl noted that there's little research to date on the value of DER combinations. But we did find some, and it revealed some surprising and intriguing results. One surprise is that combinations of DERs can sometimes have synergistic benefits. And by that, I mean that the value of the combination is greater than the sum of the value of each part. In other words, when it comes to these DER combinations, sometimes 2 + 2 = 5. Now, obviously, this is not always the case. It might be an exception to the rule. It might even be rare, but it is clearly true in some cases. And we'll try to explain that or demonstrate that with a few examples. So first, let's look at combining solar and electric vehicles. If you charge an EV with PV at the same site, that will reduce the line losses that are associated with delivering electricity to the electric vehicle charging station. And line losses are usually about 7% on average in the US, but during peak demand periods, those marginal line losses can climb as high as 20%. So combining EVs with PV at the same site can reduce primary energy consumption by a hefty percentage, and it may also reduce the need for capacity upgrades to the transmission and distribution systems. Now, furthermore, an EV that's charged with on-site solar will also have maximum environmental benefits because it's replacing fossil fuel transportation, gasoline or diesel, with a 100% zero emissions fuel. Next, let's look at combining solar with storage. This graphic shows the results from a study by researchers at 2 of our national labs. They modeled billing demand reductions for a variety of building types and also a variety of locations, solar sizes, and storage sizes. And in the case of commercial customers who combined PV with storage, the researchers found a median reduction in monthly demand charges of 42%. That compares to just an 8% reduction in billing demand if the building had PV alone, or 23% if it had storage alone. So this indicates a synergistic effect from combining solar and storage. In this case, that extra value comes from that extra value is an artifact of the retail rate design. But I would note that with almost any rate design you can imagine, customers are going to figure out ways to combine DERs to reduce their bills. So even if you change the rate design, you may see synergistic benefits. Synergies in value are also possible when PV is combined with demand response or flexible loads. And this combination may be one of the best for creating value that can be shared among all ratepayers, since demand response is really ideal for lowering system costs. One example is to use smart electric water heaters that can shift the timing of their energy consumption when they heat water to absorb excess energy from a customer's PV system. That's going to be especially valuable to the customer if they don't have full retail rate net metering, because it pays for them to use as much of their solar generation as possible on site as it's generated. Flexible loads can also shape their own energy consumption to match grid scale renewable generation. And they can even shimmy or oscillate to provide ancillary services. So wrapping up this topic, I do want to repeat that we wouldn't expect all combinations of DERs to provide synergies and value in every case. But hopefully we've demonstrated that that potential does exist. And now I'm going to hand it back to Carl to talk about how we compensate DER owners.
Thank you, John. So the actual mechanisms that provide compensation to DER resources can come from 4 different sources. It can be from bills or credits, which examples of the tariffs that establish compensation for DERs are shown in the table. An example of a bill credit that compensates customers for providing service would be something, for example, like an air conditioning load control program. Bill credits are also an interesting approach to consider when thinking about compensating customers who provide location-specific capabilities. And maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that a little bit more later. The second type of compensation is market revenues. Market revenues can provide a compensation stream. We have an example later where we talk about how market revenues can flow to aggregated DERs. Third, we have purchase power agreements or contracts. There's some that have been out there for a while. The PURPA contracts and feed-in tariffs can be used to compensate DERs and can be evaluated in a way that helps to meet system needs. A newer emerging area is all-source competitive solicitations that allow aggregated DERs to compete to provide a potential contract opportunity to meet specific needs. Finally, the fourth category of compensation comes from one-time payments or credits. We're all very familiar with tax credits of various types, perhaps EE rebate programs, and so forth. So together, these 4 different compensation mechanisms can add up to an overall compensation package, which hopefully provides a rationale for customers to invest in socially beneficial DERs or combinations of DERs. Back to you, John.
Thanks. So our report also includes a section looking at the reasons that might typically motivate a customer to deploy combinations of DERs, or for that matter, motivate a third party to aggregate DER combinations and control them for a specific purpose. For today's webinar, we're going to summarize 4 examples that illustrate the more common of these use cases for DER combinations. So let's start by returning to one of those teasers we introduced at the start of the webinar. As I said, one of the best reasons to deploy DER combinations is because doing so can turn a project that might have primarily benefited one party into a win-win project that benefits everyone. In the Steel with Sika example, a Minnesota co-op built a community solar garden that provides all the system and customer benefits one would normally expect from such a facility. But the co-op also wanted to engage customers in a demand response program so they could reduce peak-related costs even further. They did this by combining the solar and demand response programs into one attractive integrated package. And let's look at that. So co-op members who wanted solar power, they could pay $1,200 and receive the output of one of the panels from the community solar garden. Or they could pay just $170 for one panel and get a free electric water heater if they simultaneously enrolled in the co-op's demand response program. And that program manages an aggregation of customer water heaters to reduce the co-op system peaks and avoid peak prices. And amazingly, this second option was better not just for the customers who are getting a great deal, but for the co-op and all of its members because of the avoided peak costs. Carl, you want to unmute?
Another opportunity that's demonstrated is a wholesale market opportunity for combinations of DERs. While this compensation mechanism is still in its infancy, participation models are beginning to emerge that offer an avenue to offer service for value. The California ISO non-generator resource model supports resources that can quickly shift from injecting into the grid to withdrawing from the grid and back and forth. NGR was designed to accommodate storage resource participation in the grid primarily, and most resources using this participation model today are in fact storage resources. However, combinations of DERs that can quickly shift between injecting and withdrawing can qualify as an NGR resource. So what is the NGR opportunity in California at the California ISO today? Combinations of DERs together shift between injecting and withdrawing have an opportunity. The good news is that qualifying resources may provide energy, reserves, ancillary services in the day-ahead market and in the real-time market. So as the need for particular resources emerge and as the prices for those resources increase to reflect that need, value opportunities should emerge, and we should see resources, combinations of DERs participating. So the mechanism in place, which is very important, as system needs arise, the mechanism can be utilized. Aggregations of DERs that qualify at that point should be able to find value propositions that attract participation. And we'll look forward to seeing how that evolves going forward.
Resilience is another driver for combining DERs. And here the U.S. Army is leading the way. This figure summarizes projects that are underway or already installed at 18 Army bases scattered across the country. The color coding and the icons show the status of each project, and they show which types of DERs are included and whether or not the installation can operate as a microgrid when the network's down. As the variety of icons indicates, the Army's trying lots of different combinations of DERs. And also they're trying lots of different procurement models, some of which enhance resilience at little or no additional cost to taxpayers. Let's look at one example. The base at Los Alamitos, California, has plans to install a DER microgrid. In this case, a third-party developer would build, own, and operate a combination of solar and storage resources. The developer would be selling power to the grid operator during normal operations. But if the grid goes down, then the system switches into microgrid mode and serves the base's needs. It serves critical loads at the base. It would be designed to serve them for a minimum of 7 and as much as 30 days with the grid down.
Another opportunity to combine distributed resources is to address non-wired solutions to otherwise wired or generator offerings. The PG&E and East Bay Clean Energy Project created something called the Oakland Clean Energy Initiative, which is an example of such a project. And we teased this a little bit at the beginning of this webinar. This project replaces a retiring 165 megawatt Dynegy gas peaker, and it also obviates the need for some original solutions that were proposed, a 230 kV transmission line solution going through Oakland and a 115 kV transmission line going through Oakland. The initiative itself combines resources, 25 to 40 megawatts of energy efficiency, demand response, PVDG, with a minimum of 19 megawatts of those resources being able to be load reducing response, 10 megawatts and 40 megawatt hours of storage, and some substation upgrades and line re-ratings. This project emerged out of a competitive solicitation, and you can see just at a glance that the cost of this project is far less than the original proposed alternatives. We also have on this slide some resources you can look at to see where those numbers came from. Maybe it's easier to look at this with a graphic. Here are the costs of those 3 original options laid out, and here is the result of the OCEI solicitation. As you can see, it's far less expensive, far more beneficial to all ratepayers, as well as providing local economic development opportunity through those resources. Back to you, John.
All right. Our primary goal for this project was to offer a roadmap for action. In the final part of today's presentation, we're going to focus on that path forward toward capturing more value. Now, in the report, we specified almost 50 actions that could be taken to better reveal the value of DERs and DER combinations, and also to make compensation more accurate and fair. For each one, we identify the types of actors that are positioned to take the action, and these could include like DER owners, aggregators, utilities, regulators, RTOs, and even FERC. And then we group the actions into the 5 broad categories that you can see on your screen. For today's webinar, we're just going to whet your appetite by offering a handful of examples of action and try to touch on each of the 5 categories. But to see the full list, go to the report. So first, we'll start with the technology and data category. We think utilities need to deploy advanced metering infrastructure, or AMI, to secure the full range of DER benefits. Now, you can get value from DERs without AMI. There's no question about that. And it might not even be necessary to roll out AMI to all of the utilities customers, but we think AMI is essential for getting maximum value from those customers who do have DERs. Interconnection standards are also a key to unlocking value. So we recommend implementing the new IEEE Interconnection Standard and paying special attention to some of the non-mandatory inverter settings in the standard that enable DERs to provide valuable grid services. Carl?
As mentioned earlier, a rate design that reflects system cost is needed to align customer choices with grid benefit. First, let's consider the customer charges that are captured by fixed or demand charges. The fixed charge should be no more than the direct service cost of the home, the line drop, and the meter or business. To the extent that there's some additional, it's a larger normal home or a larger business where the transformer needs to be sized, that could be put into the fixed cost, or that could be addressed through a small demand charge, shown here in the second line as a transformer charge. System costs should also be collected in time-varying rates because the stress on the system varies over time. When we're in low-use times, the grid should have the low cost. When we're in higher-use times, where we're having to access higher-cost resources and where perhaps some of the infrastructure is becoming scarce, we should have a higher cost. These time-varying price signals help customers to align their usage and production in a way that supports least cost of their own, meeting their own needs, as well as least cost to the grid service for all. Finally, there should be an element of rates that addresses those very critical times, which can be quite expensive to meet. We here offer a critical peak pricing element to the rate to give customers a chance to avoid those very high costs or to offer in at those very high cost periods.
Now let's look at two of the many actions that can be taken in wholesale markets to get more value from DERs. First, we think today's forward capacity markets are rather a blunt instrument. They reward resources that match a fairly narrow definition of capacity, and they exclude resources that don't. Yes, ancillary service markets exist, but the amount of money in those markets is far less than the money in the capacity markets. So we think it makes more sense for RTOs and FERC to focus more on the full suite of capabilities that contribute to resource adequacy and power quality, to define the system need for each of those capabilities more precisely, and then to reward any resource or aggregation of resources that can provide the needed capabilities through genuinely competitive markets. Our second wholesale market example has to do with expanding opportunities for aggregations of DERs to compete. There are many barriers today. Some of the barriers include high minimum bid levels, participation models that exclude or discourage certain types of DERs or combinations, and decisions by regulators to preclude aggregators from participating directly in wholesale markets. And our report recommends knocking down these barriers.
The report also focuses on what state regulators, RTO leaders, and federal regulators can do to integrate cost-effective combinations of DERs. At the state level, the PUCs can help by implementing a distribution planning process that provides transparency into the grid, clarifies system needs on the demand side, and offers opportunities for compensation of resources that contribute to alleviating congestion and need on the grid. RTOs can also help by implementing transmission planning processes that are transparent and offer all sorts of resources, including aggregations of distributed energy resources to play. Federal regulators can help too by ensuring that transmission planning processes include the whole range of resources to address congestion on the grid, including non-wires alternatives as well as traditional resources. Across all of these, competition is very important. John?
Yeah, the last category where we have action items is utility procurement. And maybe the best example from this category is that we recommend the use of competitive all-source procurement to meet system needs. Competitive procurement can put all resources on a level playing field and that would include aggregations of DERs and include DER combinations. And competitive procurement can minimize costs for all ratepayers. So that's a key action item there. Now, as I said, you'll find dozens more action items in our full report. I put this slide up to remind you one more time on where you can find that report online. So now, for the next 15 minutes or so, we're going to try to answer as many of your questions as we can. And then if those of you want to stay into overtime, can do so. The rest of you can sign off at the top of the hour. As a reminder, because we have a large number of attendees, we're going to keep all of you muted, but you can submit questions by typing them into the questions box. And let's see, we've got a bunch of questions that have come in already, Carl. And I think I'll send one your way first.
Okay.
So the question is, what valuable ancillary services can a smart inverter on someone's PV or storage system provide?
So a smart inverter does a few things. First of all, a smart inverter can provide the capability to provide, to access fast frequency response service from a battery, for example. The smart inverter also helps because it provides visibility into the customer's device. So there are options for how smart inverters are used, but whether they're used by the customer or an aggregator pulling together resources and bidding them into the utility, or whether they're used by allowing some operational control or visibility at some times for the system operator to access those services, it's valuable either way. And it allows for verification of what exactly is going on with a resource or with a combination of resources, where you now have that real-time information and control of the resource.
Thanks. I'll field the next question. Someone asked, are there any consensus set of non-energy benefits or avoided costs in place or emerging? And I would say the answer is no. This still varies from state to state and probably always will. I would also note that the set of non-energy benefits, as Carl mentioned, depends on whether you're looking at it from the customer perspective or the utility perspective or societal perspective. But I do want to offer some hopeful news here and let people know about an effort that started in June of this year, which is an effort to develop a national standard practice manual for evaluating distributed energy resources. That effort is expected to produce a report, I think by June of 2020, that's going to try to create a standard set of energy and non-energy benefits that can be used to evaluate the cost effectiveness or the value of any type of DERs. So next question for you, Carl. Could you discuss the role of community choice agencies in advancing deployments of DER combinations?
Sure. I think it's easiest to think of a community choice aggregator as a large microgrid. It doesn't have the capabilities entirely of a microgrid, but there is the opportunity for a contiguous population of folks to act collectively kind of as if they have a microgrid. And what that allows is, they can provide services to one another within that contiguous area, thus decreasing their need to rely upon the external grid. They can also shape their net interaction with the grid just adjacent to them, so that they don't stress the grid, and so that they, in fact, have the ability to provide services and be compensated for helping out the grid. So I think, community choice aggregation is still moving forward. Getting these service capabilities in place is going to take some time. But over time, I think the opportunity to leverage community resources, both to improve service to the community, to enable opportunities for local development of resources within the community, as well as really creating value for the grid as a whole by providing that net interaction with the grid, where positive value services can be provided and where we're not adding stress to the external grid.
Thanks. Next question. I'll take this one. Are there any programs, someone asked, are there any programs that integrate energy efficiency measures with these DERs? And the answer is yes. If perhaps we weren't clear, in our report and in our own definitions, we consider energy efficiency to be a distributed energy resource. But I recognize that we didn't offer any examples of that in our presentation. So the answer is yes, and I'll elaborate maybe a couple of examples. First of all, I'm aware of at least a few places where utilities offer incentives for customers to install solar, but they aren't eligible for the incentives unless they first do an energy efficiency audit. I believe that's the case. Last time I checked, that was the case with the incentive programs run by the Connecticut Green Bank. I know it's still the case with my own local municipal utility, Fort Collins Utilities. And I think it at least was the case, I don't know if it still is, with Wisconsin's Focus on Energy program. So there's that. I would also note that a lot of resilience projects begin with energy efficiency. And let's see, let's go to a different question. Here's another one for you, Carl. Someone is interested in how all this stuff works across the retail wholesale divide, so to speak. How do all these services that are happening in the distributed system get valued in wholesale markets?
Well, again, we're into an emerging area where let's say that we're in an RTO footprint. So where the distribution utility is a part of an RTO, and there is that interface there. And of course, as we talked about with the California ISO NGR participation model and other participation models offered through the California ISO, there is an opportunity to offer resources from the distribution side of the grid aggregated up into the wholesale side of the grid. Now, the tricky part about it is that there has to be adequate visibility. There has to be adequate communication between the distribution utility and the RTO, so that we make sure that the services that are being aggregated up to provide wholesale service are not at the same time, perhaps committed to provide some kind of service or being relied upon on the distribution side. So compensation can work through a participation mechanism like I described for the California ISO. That's necessary, but it's not sufficient. What also is necessary is that communication between the distribution utility and the ISO or RTO to ensure that there's kind of a full appreciation of how these distributed energy resources are committed. This is a problem that can be solved. It's not really a problem. It's a situation that can be addressed. But it's part of the whole process of how do we get to the point of really having visibility across that boundary line. And I just want to note, this is not quite an answer to the question, but since we're on the topic, I just want to note that visibility is, very important too. Increasingly, the ISO or RTO needs to understand a little bit better what's going on the distribution side of the system so that they can anticipate how evolving needs are going to be hitting them on the wholesale side of things. So we're in the midst of building the capability of having that transparency back and forth, the distribution system operator and the wholesale operator, improving that visibility, transparency, communication. And that's really, the first step to making sure that we know what we can commit and we can be compensated for what we can commit to provide services on either side. So good question. I'm glad you asked. Thanks.
Next question. I'll take this one. So someone asked, what are the right DERs, right in quotation marks, what are the right DERs to ensure resiliency in the event of a grid outage? Well, I might surprise you if I say it starts not with storage, which most people might say, but with energy efficiency. I think the secret to ensuring resiliency is to identify what your critical loads are, the ones that you need to keep going while the grid is down, and make those loads as efficient as possible so you have the best chance of supporting them with the smallest possible installation of distributed generation and storage. I think combining distributed generation with storage is part of that right mix. If you try to ensure resiliency only with storage, you won't be able to recharge the battery, so you'll be limited to riding through an outage just as long as those batteries can supply power. But if you also have on-site distributed generation, you can extend that battery life and even recharge the batteries if your generation produced more than your immediate needs. And then obviously, you don't have resiliency during an outage unless you've also made the investment to create an islandable microgrid. One last thing is, I'd mentioned that the right type and size of the distributed generation resources is really going to depend on the local circumstances, the local climate, the timing of the critical loads at whatever the installation is. Are the critical loads 24/7 loads, or are they concentrated in certain hours of the day when maybe you do have solar generation or maybe you don't have solar generation? In some cases, it might be that a good old-fashioned backup diesel generator is the right answer for providing resilient generation. In others, solar or wind or fuel cells or something like that might work just as well or better. Let's see. I think maybe we have time for one more question before overtime. Carl, what role do see technology playing in DERs in the future?
So this really actually ties to the last question that we had about the going back and forth between the distribution system and the wholesale system as part of the same issue. We have the technology to take advantage of really a large amount of distributed energy resources: demand response, energy efficiency, distributed PV, integrated electric vehicles, storage. We have a lot of resources being deployed on the grid that are going to become increasingly cost effective. The more they're going to become more valuable as we get the technology in place that allows transparency and visibility into what the grid needs, the translation of that into markets for offering grid services, translation of that into qualifying resources, qualifying distributed energy resources to provide those services and meet those needs. And it's exciting because ultimately we all really benefit by really taking advantage of information technology and communications in a way that we don't quite yet do, because we're still adapting to what technology can allow today. So I would say that DER's role is only just beginning, that integration of DERs, combination of DERs is a portfolio that can meet all sorts of needs locally and on the larger grid, is only just starting, and it will be enabled by deployment of these information, communication, and control technologies.
Thanks, Carl. Unfortunately, we've got a lot of questions remaining, and we're basically out of time for our scheduled webinar. As I said, Carl and I are going to stay on for another half an hour, and we're going to keep plowing through these questions. We hope many of you can stay, but we wanted to give the rest of you a chance to sign off in the allotted hour as originally planned. But before we finish, I'd like to take the chance to review those three key takeaways from our report one more time. So again, first is that combinations of DERs are offering new value opportunities. And again, the goal there is to reasonably compensate those DERs that can produce positive net benefits. We're not talking about subsidizing DERs for DER's sake. The second key takeaway is that regulators and policymakers are going to need to enable new technologies to improve tariffs and to reform market planning and procurement processes. And then the third takeaway is that the owners of DERs, utilities, state regulators, and federal agencies can all take steps now to encourage beneficial DERs. So that's it. Thank you all for joining us today. As always, we welcome your feedback. And for those of you who are interested, we're going to stay on this same line, don't log out, for another half hour to answer additional questions. For the rest of you, goodbye and have a great day. All right. So I'm going to go back to the questions that have poured in. And I think, Carl, you did the last one. I will take the next question. What valuation framework does RAP use to compare different combinations of DERs? Well, let's see. We generally aren't doing cost effectiveness valuations, but we certainly read a lot of them and think a lot about these issues. So I think Carl is pretty clear in noting that each valuation framework is answering a different question. It's answering the question about cost effectiveness or value from a different perspective. And what I would say in general is that each of them has value so long as you keep in mind that they're answering a specific question about perspective. I generally would suggest to people that it makes the most sense to evaluate value and cost effectiveness from multiple perspectives using multiple tests. But ultimately, I'd be lying if I didn't say that I personally think that the societal cost test is the one test that looks at value, looks at costs and benefits comprehensively, and truly answers the question of whether the cost of a resource is more than the benefits or less than the benefits. And the other cost tests get more at allocating the full suite of benefits. So how much of the benefits are going to the participant or to other ratepayers or to society. So in general, I feel like the societal test is the one, is probably the best test to figure out, is this resource worth it? But the other tests are extremely important because they answer the question of who should pay how much for that resource to make sure that everyone benefits.
Hey, John. Can I ask you a clarifying question that we've talked about? Sure. But one thing you didn't mention was that when we go and work with states, we find that different states are different. Different states have different policy priorities. Could you talk a little bit about when RAP helps different states, how do we work with them to help fit what their objectives and goals are together with what these different tests provide?
Sure. So a lot of what we do is make sure that states know what their peers are doing and explaining the usefulness of each of those different tests. One that I didn't mention is this, Carl referred to it as the newer test, the resource value test. And that's an interesting one because it's like a utility cost test. Is this resource cost effective from the perspective of the utility? But it adds to that the costs and benefits that are associated with meeting established policies adopted by that individual state. So if the state has adopted policies to try to address climate change, then you would add climate change related costs and benefits to the utility cost test in that state. That's what the resource value test does. And that's emerging as one that's interesting to a lot of states. But in general, I would say our advice to states is to look at multiple tests so that they can answer the question about value from multiple perspectives. Carl, here's another one for you. Should utilities be allowed to own PV and storage that's behind the meter to incentivize that deployment? That's an easy one.
Oh, well, this kind of gets into the different states are different, so I'll just say that I for me personally, that's not my first choice. But I do think that getting distributed energy resources engaged and productively contributing in helping along the pathway towards building the grid of the future, where we have much more interactive resources on the demand and the supply side, is if we want to steal from Star Trek, the prime directive maybe. So I would say that if in the state that you're in, if that's the pathway toward progress, then I wouldn't leave that stone unturned. However, if there's an appetite for competition, if there are enabling statutes to allow for competition, then I think having customers, aggregators invest in and control those technologies and offer services up to a platform that's created by the distribution utility to sell energy and services and to purchase energy and services from that marketplace. To me, that's the direction we want to go. And there's the danger that if only the utility owns and controls the resources behind the meter, then we really won't realize the potential for that competitive, interactive, dynamic, transactive grid. That being said, it is true that we talked about smart inverters earlier, and we talked about obtaining services from the smart inverters to help to meet local needs. So let's say, for example, that a utility runs a pilot where they have a congested area of the grid, where they have a significant amount of distributed energy resources already deployed in that grid, where there's an opportunity to use the information and controls through smart inverters to mitigate congestion and avoid an expense that the ratepayers at large are going to pay. To me, if I were still a regulator, I would consider that. Is this a pathway of helping us toward the future, demonstrating the capability of using these behind-the-meter resources to meet system needs? Again, it's not my first choice, but I think the bigger picture is distributed energy resources are here. They're here to stay. They're going to become a dynamic part of the grid, and figuring out how we take advantage of them, use them to meet system needs, avoid costs, and ultimately inculcate, the dynamic forces of entrepreneurialism by customers and third parties is the end game. What's the pathway to the end game? I don't know. I would think carefully before utility behind the meter stuff, but I wouldn't write it off out of hand personally. And I will say that probably different people at RAP would have answered this question differently than I would.
Probably answer any question differently. Next question for me. Someone says they'd love to learn more about best practices for incorporating transmission and distribution planning into IRPs, that's integrated resource plans, and which utilities are doing it best. Good question with several parts to it. First of all, I think almost everywhere today there is a divide between the planning at the distribution level and at the bulk power level, which, the generation and transmission planning are separate from the distribution planning. I know that the state of Hawaii has begun to make some advances at integrating planning from the distribution system all the way through the bulk power system, integrated way. I also know that NARUC, the National Association for Utility Commissioners, and NASIO, which is the National Association for State Energy Offices, are in the midst of a 2-year effort working with states to develop sort of model processes for doing a more integrated approach to planning. So that's what I could say about integrating those things. Separately, I could tell you that distribution system planning is a really rapidly changing and improving field. We're seeing lots of interesting research and best practices coming out of groups like GridLab, and we're seeing distribution planning exercises that are being driven by commission orders in places like Minnesota. Those might be a couple places that I would look to for best practices on distribution planning, and they do focus really heavily on how to consider distributed energy resources in distribution planning. At the bulk level, I think maybe the best example I've seen is the integrated resource plans from the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, which I think has long been on the cutting edge of considering energy efficiency and now demand response in its bulk power system plans, as well as some of the smaller distributed generation. Last time I checked, including storage in these plans is still a really tricky technical challenge for planners, because how the storage systems are used is so integral to figuring out how they can contribute to system needs. And that's a pretty tricky one where I think incremental progress is made in a lot of places, but there's still to be done. Let's go back to you, Carl. Another easy one. Should the owners of DERs be required to pay the capital cost where networks need upgrading to manage like voltage or thermal constraints?
So, I would say that it depends on the size of the installation. So is there anything in this question about what size we're talking about? Are we talking about at a residence or, pardon me?
No, there's nothing in it about size.
Okay. Well, I would say that, typically there are, the interconnection agreement that you develop, going through the update of the IEEE 1547 and figuring out, what is the, what does interconnection with the technology that we have today look like? And, I would say in the vast majority of places, the smaller DER devices are not having an impact on the grid in a significant way. There's plenty of space. Grids were built with analog-based assumptions, not digital-based assumptions. So there tends to be space on the grid in most places in the country. And so I would say in most places in the country, it's going to be a little while before an individual DER is causing congestion. That being said, you get into the situation of, someplace like a Hawaii or California where you have a lot of adoption happening. Some of it's happening locally. How what do you do in that situation where indeed there's kind of a threshold where now we need system improvements in order to accommodate additional resources, whatever it may be, whether it's vehicle charging, a lot of vehicle charging happening in a place, or a lot of solar in a place, or something like that. So as a foundational matter, I would say the goal is to make the grid plug and play to the extent possible, that there's a public good in creating that that plug and play public grid, and that would mean that generally the grid should be improved, not with individual DERs paying for those threshold investments, but for there being an assessment in like this distribution system planning process where we identify where are the places across the grid where we're going to need upgrades, and is this upgrade going to allow for beneficial investment that's competitive with other resources and providing therefore benefits to all? And we say yes, it is. And I'd say that's a candidate for being socialized as part of the grid modernization effort. Now there are, once you get into larger resources where individual resources are causing, discrete needs on the grid, just like in a larger commercial and industrial facility, when you interconnect a big energy user to the grid, then they accept the cost impact of the direct impacts of their facility. There's some dedicated facilities that were corrected. There may even be a little bit down the road where they're having an impact. So there's a similar judgment call that needs to be made here. When we're talking about a large facility, then maybe it makes sense to assess that. When we're talking about building out the grid in a way where we have a more transactive, dynamic, towards a plug and play type of grid, then I think that's more something that I would consider a candidate for socializing that cost.
Okay. I'm going to take the next. It talks about competitive procurement. And a listener asked, doesn't that leave energy efficiency in the same market failure bucket it always has been in, compared to other resources that are therefore more easily financed? I want to answer this in two ways. And first is to say, I don't think it necessarily leaves efficiency in the same market failure bucket. And what I would say is, if you look at the history to date on non-wires alternatives, and Carl mentioned the Oakland Clean Energy Initiative as one of those, when utilities have identified a need and then solicited non-wires alternatives through a competitive process, I think it's not that there are a whole lot of those examples around the country, but among the few examples there are, I think we quite often see that energy efficiency ends up in the mix. Third parties are bringing forward offers to produce energy savings as part of those non-wires solicitations, and getting compensated for that. Secondly, I would note that we, the collective we, are really making some great advances towards making energy efficiency more of a measurable resource that can be procured and indeed financed in the same way that other resources are, using more of the smart metering technology, we can demonstrate energy efficiency savings using the technology and algorithms so that we know how much energy is actually saved and have contracts in place to pay for actual performance, which is different than the old programs that we developed to address market failures, where we would assume levels of savings through either savings or engineering calculations and provide people incentives up front, but never actually pay them for performance. So I think that both of those developments have the potential to put energy efficiency on a level playing field with other distributed and bulk resources. So let's see, Carl. Wading through these questions. Here's one that you might like. It's about rate design, which you covered in the presentation. It says that time of use and critical peak pricing tariffs are better than flat rates, but they're still static. And they cannot dynamically adjust to actual real-time system costs. Because of that, they're not truly cost reflective or economically efficient. So to optimize DER implementation and operation, do we need to go to real-time pricing? Are you muted or thinking?
I was muted. Thank you, John. That's okay. So real-time pricing, I think, is is ultimately actually I gave a presentation that's on our on RAP online. If you just Google for my name and for HEPG, for Harvard Electric Policy Group, I did a presentation about a year ago that talked about, kind of my view on dynamic pricing. So I'm excited by dynamic pricing. I agree that dynamic pricing, when available, on the down to the distribution system, down to a much more granular level than it is available in many places today, is a helpful price signal to respond to the actual conditions on the grid in specific places at specific times. And so that, in that sense, it's exciting. On the other hand, when we think about resources in the, well, first of all, in this presentation that I have, I talk about what conditions need to be met on the grid where before we can really truly rely on real-time pricing to deliver. And I talk about a few different things. The technology needs to be in place. The pricing needs to be down to a more granular level than it's available in many places today. There's an effort. There's also the question of, is this a default tariff or is it an opt-in tariff? If it's opt-in, then I'm okay with doing it quickly and seeing how it works. If it's a default tariff, then you've got customers are going to need to figure out how to interact with real-time prices. I think third-party aggregators can be very helpful. Even utility tariffs can be helpful in providing a gateway where we're both paying attention to the real-time pricing signals and offering the customer a customer-facing deal where the customer feels comfortable, and somebody is managing in the background so that value is being produced and the customer is sharing in that value and contributing value to the grid. Unfortunately, I just don't think we're quite at that place where we can make that a default tariff in most places. So I think as an optional tariff, I think it's a good idea. You know, I do think that another element of if the only compensation for resources is going to be interacting with the market, then you have to ask the question about what, you know, what is the tolerance that customers have for scarcity pricing, because an important aspect of depending on real-time prices is that in order for projects to be financed, then you have to experience the whole range of prices that the system might deliver, and some of those might be high. So, and you know, could be even, you know, alarming to folks. Now, in the scheme of things, that can be managed by a third-party aggregator or whomever to produce net value for customers. But I do know that that's in some places that's an acquired taste. So, so my answer to the question is generally yes. Time of use prices, as the questioner mentioned. Moving from flat prices to time of use prices is a necessary step. Relying less on demand charges, and when you relying on them to be, you know, coincident demand charges that, you know, reflect what's going on in the system is a good step. Offering an optional time of use, an optional real-time price tariff, I think is a great idea. I think, you know, outlining the steps towards moving towards that better use of that information is an important step. But I think jumping to real-time pricing too quickly could cause customers to have a negative reaction to markets in general, to the transformation that we're undergoing in general, and could slow things down. So me personally, and again, I think not everybody at RAP, at my organization, would agree with me on this, so we'd have different opinions. But my observation is, yes, we want to move toward that, but there's potential harm in doing it too quickly and causing a negative backlash. So that's about what I can do with that one, John. Back to you.
Thanks, Carl. Unfortunately, we're going to run out of time before we answer all the questions. I'm going to try to field one more before we sign off, and with apologies to the rest of you. The question is, what are the parameters that regulators can control and design to capture the value of DER combinations? Is it only about tariff structure? The answer there is no, it is not just about tariff structure, although, as Carl's said repeatedly, retail rate design is extremely important. Other things that regulators can affect or control, I've mentioned a few of them before, but I'll add to that list, is they do have some say in how their states will implement the new interconnection standards. They certainly have control over at least approving or rejecting utility investments in automated metering infrastructure. They can initiate distribution system planning processes, which I said are fairly new and are a really powerful way to identify the value of distributed energy resources. What else? State regulators have the authority to either allow or not allow aggregators of demand response to bid into wholesale markets where the state's utilities are participating in wholesale markets. That's a state regulator decision. States can encourage or require their least to do competitive procurement. So I hope it's clear that there's more they can do than just smart retail rate design. And I want to repeat that in our report where we list those 40-some action items, you could just go through the column for state utility regulators and see which of those actions we think utility regulators have some influence or control over. But with that, our half hour has expired. And I do want to thank those of you who stuck with us. Apologize that we just couldn't get through the long list of questions that we had. We do welcome further input offline. You should have our contact information. And wish all of you a fine rest of your Tuesday. So long.